C-U-M-M-I-N-G-S. You've probably seen them.
Oh, yeah, I could write an essay like this.
Yeah.
I don't know, I have things to say. You can write about that and try not to worry about sounding too professional.
Right.
Get words on a page, and I over-explain myself enough that I feel like I can get it.
That's good. Rather over-explain, and then you can write. We say sometimes, write drunk, edit sober. Not that you get drunk, but yeah, if you overdo it at first, you can always go back and edit it, and it's easier to take away than to add.
I might actually write drunk just to see what I can do.
You might be surprised with what you come up with.
I might be. I did end up getting work off for this weekend, and I'm like, thank you, past self, for
Nice.
in that request.
Yes. Hey, bud. Groovy jacket. Groovy shacket, I believe is the term.
Ask you something about jihadism?
Of course, my friend.
I was just kind of like Googling in general.
Okay.
I couldn't get a sense of if I felt like I was getting answers on both sides. If like mainstream, like Sunni and Shia mainstream Islam accepts that, or like even recognizes that jihadism is actually like a real thing.
It's highly individualistic.
Okay.
It's kind of like you can walk down the street and not tell here who's a Democrat or a Republican. I mean, if they're wearing the hat, you know, or if they have purple hair, you can kind of tell, right?
Okay.
But other than that, like if, you know, the three of us were in a photograph together, I don't know if you could tell who's which. But so, and then there's also the problem of what people will admit to.
Yeah.
And there's also the problem of who's listening to them and what they have to say to not get in trouble with that person.
Yeah.
But I get the sense that it's, you know, Palestinians are a lot, they live in an open air prison, right? They live in an apartheid state. And so resistance is going to be something that interests them more because their material conditions are so shit. But if you're an ecstasy dealer in Tehran, right? Tehran has the best ecstasy in the world, so I'm told. Right? I would not go there to check it out. Imagine that. Although if I'm going to get decapitated, get on some Molly, right? But anyway, that aside, that person's going to think it's ridiculous, you know what I mean? So it's highly, you know, you can't really speak about it monolithically. I get the feeling, just because I've been reading about this since 2001, actually before. I was interested in Osama bin Laden in the 90s, because I'm going to join. I'm just kidding. No, I just thought, okay, this is a threat. Let's keep track of this threat. And lo and behold, right, 4 or 5 years later, there we are. But yeah, I was researching that in the Clinton administration. Because the internet was brand new and it was like, oh my God, I can go to all these news sites. This is awesome. And so, of course, the shiniest thing, the thing that blows up, right? I'm a Star Wars fan. Ergo, if it blows up, I like it. Or I'm interested in it, right? It distracts me like a monkey. I would put it at like 30 or 40% pro-violence, pro-jihadi violence. You know, I mean, there's so many dimensions to it because we say, oh my gosh, they make women wear burqa, right? Cover up their whole bodies. Well, if you drive down any major boulevard in Los Angeles, what do you see is a skyline filled with these giant pictures of women barely dressed. So we demand that our women strip, right? I don't think that's as bad as covering them up, but, you know, both of us can point fingers at each other about how we treat women, for example, you know?
Yeah, and they, you know, many Middle Eastern countries report like the lowest crimes against women, but that, I don't know accounts for non-reporting.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I think maybe it's just accepted more socially, like honor killings. If you don't marry this ugly bastard that I've cooked up for you,
Yeah,
we're gonna put you in a hole in the ground and throw stones into you until you die.
yeah, I think, yeah.
It's freaking barbaric. But yeah, but as for the support, generally, yeah, I would say it's about 2-to-1 against. But I don't know how I get that impression. I mean, I may have read a survey result, but I just don't remember it. But I do get the impression that it's not widespread acceptance.
Muhammad's teachings weren't like inherently anti-violent either.
Well, yeah, none of the religions are. I mean, in Myanmar, the Buddhists are killing up Muslims, right? Even the Buddhists are hacking people apart, right?
Yeah, the Crusades.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The Crusades, exactly, or hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of American Christians cheering on people getting thrown in vans in Chicago and Portland. You know, so wow, I really wish more people would show up, but I need to start because I've got a lot to cover today. So, in 2001, in January of that year, I was made redundant at my job working at an internet firm doing accounting for them. So I thought, okay, they gave me a nice 3-month pay recovering compensation package, right? And so I decided now's the time I'm going to go back to grad school and study philosophy. And so the first thing I started, I just took one class my first semester just to ease back into it because it had been 6 years since I got my bachelor's, and 7 years. And the class met for 2 hours every Wednesday night. And the professor looked like Socrates. He had this big-ass white beard, bald head, and he sat in the chair at the front of the class. He didn't stand to lecture. He would get up every once in a while to write stuff down, but he would just sit and talk from behind the table up front. And when everybody had sat down in the class the day after September 11th, 2001, he looked around at us and he said, "What happened yesterday in New York City is no different from what happens every single day in this world." I was like, "Bro, you ever heard of Too Soon?" Wow. And so I remember Time Magazine, the first issue of Time Magazine that came out after 9/11, the cover was, "Why do they hate us?" And it took them 1 week, the next issue of Time, to come up with the answer. They hate us because we're free, right? Like, don't hate me because I'm beautiful, right? And so even Osama bin Laden addressed that from his cave, right? Somewhere in northwestern Afghanistan, or northeastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistani border. He said, "Look, if I were out killing people because they're free, I would have blown up Amsterdam." Anybody here been to Amsterdam? It's free. My ex-wife is from South Africa, and we would fly San Francisco to Amsterdam to Johannesburg. And so I would stop there and run a few errands, if you know what I mean, when going through there. For the term paper, the prompt is, can global jihadism be defeated using military means alone? And I'm putting myself on the game board and saying, no, that in addition to the military component, in order to defeat jihadism, and I think it should be defeated, and the reason I think it should be defeated is because their main thing is they target non-combatants. That's unjustifiable, right? So again, we're not studying jihadism to justify it. Explaining something and justifying it are two very different things, and the reason I want to explain it is for the same reason Sun Tzu gives. Know thyself, know thy enemy, 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories. And so to study them, in addition to, right, and I'm not saying we should do away with the military component. We're not going to be putting daffodils in their AKs, guys, right? That's goofy. So there is going to be a military component, unfortunately. What I'm suggesting is that 2 other things are needed. One is an economic address, because these people resort to terrorism because of the conditions of their country folk. The global economy has not benefited them sufficiently. And so we need to democratize the GBEO in the way that Poga says. That's the economic track. So we've got the war track, which we can't avoid. The economic track we need to add, and we also need to add the hearts and minds stuff and win the philosophical argument. We talked in a previous class about the fact that the United States is the global hegemon. Remember what that term means? Hegemon, H-E-G-E-M-O-N, is the predominant power. And we, as a human species, are too much still in our adolescence. Look at the way we're trashing our one and only home. Look at the way we're fighting over stupid shit. Look at all the babies we're killing for dumb reasons, right? Because, yeah. And so if we, as adolescents, need a parent, right, a hegemon, who do you want it to be? Do you want China to be global cop? Look at their human rights record. It's worse than ours. How about Russia? Totally worse than ours. They're animals, man. I take that back, and I recall all the human beings. I mean, we are all animals, right? It's not animals and then humans. Here's animals and here's humans within that subset, right? But, yeah, if we're going to act as global cop, and unfortunately we need a global cop, it's the United States, and so we are garrisoned. We have military bases all over the world. And so it's very plausible for people outside of the United States, or even in the United States, to have voices saying to them, the United States is an evil empire, right? But I believe more in the picture that I've put in, that as, you know, adolescents, we need a hegemon, and who do you want it to be? So we're the reluctant empire, that's my defense, right? Some of us not so reluctant, but I think the average American citizen doesn't want to have global conquest or invade Venezuela for more freaking oil, right? And so in making the case that, and I'm making the philosophical case, I've already made the economic case, right, with Thomas Poga, but the overarching moral case is that in order for us to win the hearts and minds, if you will, win the argument over whether or not we're an evil empire or a benevolent one, right? A bit of both, maybe, but is to show that, yes, the United States has made mistakes in international relations just over the course of the 20th century, right? And so, look, if we're the Avengers, and there are creatures coming from another dimension coming to destroy New York and then the whole world, we have the moral upper hand. We're defending Earth, right? We're the Avengers. Use all the military force, use the superpowers and just blow the hell out of every one of them. Hulk smash. Go for it, right? But when we look at the past, it's not so clear that we're the Avengers, right? That we're the heroes in this. So looking at the past, what we're going to do today, we don't seem to have the moral upper hand. But if we can admit and say, okay, look, nothing about the Middle East without the Middle East's input, right? We're going to have a conversation with you guys and stop imposing this system upon you, right? And part of that is saying we acknowledge past transgressions and vow to try our best not to repeat them, right? That's part of the argument. And so what I want to do is look back and go over a few instances of what we call hubris. Remember that hubris is the Greek word for arrogance, placing oneself above others. Whereas the word Muslim means surrendering one's will, placing it at the feet of God, if you will, right? So going under as opposed to going over. That's the tension here. So if we can look at legitimate grievances and admit that they need to be addressed, then we're not stuck just saying they hate us because we're free, right? Now, all of these can be, and you only need to use one in your term paper. And when you go to Wikipedia, I'm just going to really quickly tell you what each of these is. And when you go to Wikipedia to study that particular aspect, that particular historical event for your term paper, and this will go in the jihadi section or in the how do they get into conflict, right? Don't even cite Wikipedia. Just put it in there like you know it, because these events are now far enough in the past, even the Second Iraq War, that the facts are plain for all to see. The facts are uncontroversial. Whether or not we should have done these things is controversial, but that's that's separate from the fact that you can cite these things without worrying about getting the facts straight. So, the first one, after World War I, the Allied powers defeated, among others, the Ottoman Empire, right, that had reigned supreme for hundreds of years. And when we vanquished the Ottoman Empire, we broke it up into separate nations, the map of what is now known as the Middle East, right? Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Turkey, etc., right? The UAE. That's North Africa. But anyway, and when we created those new nation states after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the maps, the new maps that established these new nations, were drawn by an Englishman and a Frenchman. Sykes was an Englishman, Picot was a Frenchman. And the nations that they created by drawing a map up in Europe, over in Europe, right? The political lines in the new nations were created by piecing together territory with respect to the Western, foreign powers that had stakes, right? That had stakes in what was underground there, right? The minerals and the oil, right? And so what happened was when you created a state like, say, Iraq, you were drawing lines based upon what was under the ground instead of who lived on the ground. And when you do that, you can divide cohesive social groups that had been cohesive for hundreds of years into separate nations. And you're separating families and things like that. Or, worse still, you create a new nation state in which you're grouping together traditionally hostile groups, right? 2 groups or 3 groups that are hostile to one another. And saying, here you go, guys, live together and make a go of this nation state, right? So the hubris here, the arrogance, is that the lines were drawn with respect to what was under the ground instead of who was on the ground, which prioritized the resources over the people. Big surprise, right? Any questions on that one? Operation Ajax, 1953. Up until 1952, the state of Iran had what's called Shah, S-H-A-H, which is just the word for king in Farsi. They're not Arabic, they're Persian, so they speak not Arabic, but Farsi, F-A-R-S-I. But in 1952, Iran was advanced enough that they finally decided to democratize. And they held their first national election and elected as president Dr. Mohammed, come on, David, M-O-S-S-A-D-E-Q, Mossadegh, Mohammed Mossadegh, Dr. Mohammed Mossadegh, who, as the representative of the democratically elected representative of the state of Iran, wanted to take care of his people, right? As the representative, he wanted to take care of the populace. And so he asked the company called Aramco, again, you'll find this in the Wikipedia page, if you go there, said, hey, can we make a new deal? Can we rewrite the contract so that more of the money you're extracting from under our ground stays in the country because my people are starving and suffering and so on? And the CEO of Aramco went to Winston Churchill, and said, hey, I've got this guy who's, trying to take my money away from me. And so Winston Churchill told Mohammed Mossadegh to take a long walk off a short pier, right, get lost. He refused. And so Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, right, the extraction industry in Iran, which, that's a no-no, right? And so Churchill went to Eisenhower, our president, and said, hey, we've got this guy over here, can you take care of him? And so in 1953, Operation Ajax was conducted by the CIA to overthrow Mossadegh, and it worked, right? They what's called fomented means stir up, a coup d'etat, and replaced him the first democratically elected leader, with a king. They gave him back a king, right? So the hubris there is democracy for me, but not for thee, if you will. Any questions on that one? In the 1980s, right, from 1953 until 1979, which is also a good Smashing Pumpkins song, the Shah had taken anybody who disagreed with how he governed the country as a king, people who wanted democracy, right? And he had a secret police force that terrorized the populace and put people in these huge detention centers and just tortured the living crap out of them, sometimes literally, right? And so from 1953 until 79, the population of Iran was being terrorized by its leader. And so the Shah had such complete control using his secret police that moves to democratization wouldn't have worked. And so instead, in order to overthrow the Shah, the Iranian people resorted to jihadism, basically, right? And declared Iran to be an Islamic republic, okay? So that year, our Secretary of Defense under, or not that year, a year or two later, in the Reagan administration, the Secretary of Defense, namely Donald Rumsfeld, you may have heard his name, went to Iraq, next door to Iran, and talked with his very, very good buddy, Saddam Hussein. That's Saddam Hussein. You know him from South Park, probably. No, I'm kidding. But, and said to him, hey, go to war with this Islamic Republic. We will give you all the weapons you need, all of the satellite imagery you need, and so on. And Saddam Hussein was such an incompetent prick that it took 9 years and he didn't actually beat Iran, even though he had all this American help. Okay, so that's one track. The other track was, because as it turns out the hubris here is going to be, the United States was double dealing weapons to both sides, right? Giving the impression that, hey, the more these fuckers kill each other up, the fewer people between us and their oil. And how did our oil get under their sand in the first place? I blame the dinosaurs. But anyway, right? In South America, and this is what's known as the Iran-Contra affair, you can look this up as well if you wish. The Iran-Contra affair, the Contras were right-wing death squads that were fighting against the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas, you know, getting this in the woods, I'm just brushing past it quick. But the Sandinistas were left-wing guerrillas who were trying to, right with the backing of the Soviet Union and Cuba and so on, trying to make socialist or communist governments in South America to better serve the people, which they kind of don't, right? But in any case, the right-wing death squads were killing up people left, right, and center. And finally, Congress got involved because there were nuns from the United States, Catholic nuns, namely the Maryknoll, M-A-R-Y-K-N-O-L-L, nuns who went down there to observe and protect the people down there that were being killed by the death squads, and the nuns got killed by the death squads. So that really got, when you kill brown people, it's like, okay. But when you kill white people, watch out, right? Okay. And so Congress got involved and cut off funding to the Contras. So in response to Congress cutting off funds to the Contras, the Reagan White House, through one Colonel Oliver North, set up an operation in the basement of the White House where Colonel North sold missiles and chemical weapons. Not chemical weapons. Chemical weapons we gave to Saddam. That's why in 2001, right, well, I'll get to that in a second, right? I don't want to get ahead of myself. But we sold them missiles. We sold Iran missiles, even though we were giving weapons to Iraq to destroy Iran, so that we could get money to give to the Contras. Okay, and that came out in the open, and whether or not the president knew was a whole controversy and yada yada. Yeah.
And Oliver North's motivation was just anti-communism. That was his motive.
He was serving Reagan, right? He was a very devout, you know, anti-communist. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well said. So, the hubris there is that we were double dealing. In the second Iraq War, it's funny, I got here in 2004, and the students and the general populace, right, and students and their parents were all incredibly pro-Iraq War. And it's been interesting in the ensuing 21 years teaching here to see how that attitude has shifted as the actual facts of the matter come out. Now, I don't blame anybody for that. I think if you supported the Iraq War, it was because you were misled, right? And I remember in 2001 through 2003, 2003 was when we finally overthrew Saddam Hussein, that there were a rolling set of justifications, right? First of all, we said, well, they're responsible for 9/11. Nope, that's our good buddy, the Saudis. Remember, Mohammed bin Salman was in the White House just last week, right? Checking out the bling Oval Office that Trump has put in there. Right? And so it was like, okay, they didn't do 9/11, but they have weapons of mass destruction, right? And we knew that because they got them from us, right? We had the receipts, right? And in fact, around that time, there was a UN weapons inspector who happened to be American named Scott Ritter, who said, no, those things are now inert. They can't hurt anybody. They've gone beyond their sell-by date or use-by date. And so then it was about building democracy, yada, yada, yada. We wanted to go in anyway. And that's for other reasons having to do with neoconservatism. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that. But so the hubris in the Second Iraq War is that we destroyed a country under false pretenses. Okay? So any of those single ones can be used to make the case that when we look to the past, it's not clear that we have the moral upper hand. And so, since we don't have the moral upper hand the way the Avengers do, we can't use military means alone. So that's one pillar of my defense for a no answer to the question, can jihadism be defeated using military means alone? Okay? Now, admitting these things, admitting these past transgressions, is not to condone terrorism, right? I call these legitimate grievances, and if legitimate grievances can be addressed, that makes the evil empire image not so persuasive anymore, okay? And if that story can be won in terms of hearts and minds, if we win the philosophical argument, right, then it's less likely that jihadis will resort, that people will become jihadis in the first place, right? Because look, you're in some Middle Eastern country, and you're, the 320th dude standing in line to see if there's work at the oil refinery today with all these other dudes in their sandals in the sand and dust, right? And no, sorry, we're all done. So that's day 480 for you of not having any work. You're watching your kids, go hungry. And suddenly a soccer ball comes your way. Oh, you stuff the soccer ball. There's a guy over there with his head covered and stuff, and he's like, hello, you look like a good Muslim. Would you like to take care of your family for the next 3 generations? Just put on this vest and go to that American base over there. We'll take care of the rest, right? So poor areas of the world, like the one I've just described, that have been neglected by globalization, right? The economic track means we should POGA-ize, right, democratize the GBEO so that it reaches more people and makes them less desperate and have the global economy be subject to moral evaluation and not just the profit motive, okay? But without that, leaving things as it is, we have a situation in which economic inequality leads to conflict, either terrorism or war, right? So as Poga says, the GBEO, Global Basic Economic Order, that the US and others maintain violates negative human rights. And if we stop doing this, there will be less reason for resorting to terrorism. Okay, so that's how Poga comes in as an argument that is part of what I'm saying is sufficient. I don't know if it's going to be sufficient, but it's certainly closer to the mark than just doing military whack-a-mole ad infinitum. We have the military track, which we're going to have to keep, unfortunately, but we have to add to that the economic track and the philosophical track, okay? So we might not have the moral upper hand when we speak historically, let's now see whether or not we have the moral upper hand today in terms of military conflict. And I'm going to start this lecture now, and probably we'll get to the end of it at the beginning on Wednesday. Then after I take maybe 5 or 10 minutes to do that on Wednesday, 15 tops, I'll put up the term paper prompt and we can hash that out and see, make sure we see how everything fits together, okay? You guys can pepper me with questions, okay? So I'm gonna make myself some space here. And look, if you guys object to anything that I'm putting down today, don't hesitate to push back. It's fine. I'm making a case here. I'm not insisting that you buy it. And if you don't buy it and you want to argue against it, I will help you do that. Otherwise, I should not be up here. Okay? Von Clausewitz. Karl von Clausewitz was a German philosopher of war, right? There were other philosophers of war before him. One of them was Grotius. Another one is St. Augustine, right? Catholics who basically were saying, this is horrible to the eye of God, right? We need to do something about reducing the horrors of war. But it really comes to Karl von Clausewitz that makes it kind of analytic, if you will. And Karl von Clausewitz made the following statement once. He said, war is politics by other means. So we're doing philosophy of war now, by the way. We've gone from globalization and the 3 ideologies to philosophy of war, okay? Or more specifically, justice in war, okay? Which, how do we distinguish just from unjust wars, okay? So what do you think Clausewitz means when he says war is politics by other means? What is that? You want to take a crack at that? I don't know what I'm talking to you about. David Harbour? You know who David Harbour is?
I don't.
Oh, he's the sheriff from Stranger Things.
Oh, okay, I haven't seen Stranger Things.
Oh, has nobody ever said that to you?
No.
Am I right, bro?
Yeah.
It's really good. I fucking love that guy. No, I've been trying to figure out, you remind me of somebody. I just figured it out.
Oh, it's the mustache.
Hopper. Yeah, Hopper. It's the whole bone structure, the haircut, the beard, everything.
It's funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you would like, at least the first season is good.
I'll watch it. I think I watched the first couple episodes and then gave up.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't catch everybody.
Yeah.
I was the age of those kids playing Dungeons and Dragons at that time. So I'm like, it's us. It's crazy. All the other stuff didn't happen, as you might imagine. But yeah, war is politics by other means. Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I don't know. I'm thinking how little kids will solve things amongst each other.
Oh.
I watched 2 of my little cousins over Thanksgiving break constantly get into fighting matches
over certain stakes.
Yeah.
Over whose decision is going to prevail.
I want to play with the fire truck. No, I want to play with the fire truck.
Yeah, who gets the fire truck? Perfect. So yeah, it's basically, the point that he's making is that politics is one way of deciding, right? Voting, or conversation, or just saying my way or the highway, in the case of autocracy. That politics is a way of deciding which ideology is going to arrange society in that particular geographic area, right? France, or Utah, right? And war is another way of doing that as well, right? Is Nicaragua going to be capitalist or communist, right? That can be decided through conversation or through weapons. There are 3, right? The fact of war is like the fact of globalization. Nobody questions that it exists. The whole argument is about whether or not it's justifiable in its current form, okay? In the case of globalization and in the case of war, whether or not it's justifiable given the circumstances of that particular military campaign. When we say just war or unjust war, we don't mean, for example, was World War II just? That doesn't really make any sense, right? When we say war, what we mean is the military campaign waged by a particular entity, whether a government or other organization like Al-Qaeda, right? So we can say that the Ukrainian war, right, the war that's being waged by the military of Ukraine is just because they're engaging in self-defense. Right? It's ridiculous to say there's no right to self-defense. If somebody says to me there's no right to self-defense, I'll be like, okay, great, pow, your stuff is mine, right? So, and then, you know, even in the same war, say World War II, right, the US military strategy can change at different times, right? Authoritarianism was rolling across the globe, and for all democracy's faults, it has a better human rights record than authoritarianism does. And so it was perfectly justifiable for the US to cross the English Channel and storm the beaches at Normandy, Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, and so on, to fight the authoritarianism and worldwide, genocide of the Jewish people. Later in that same war, after Curtis LeMay, who led the Army during World War II, the Army, there was no Air Force yet, the Army controlled the planes and the bombers. But Curtis LeMay, General Curtis LeMay, had ordered the bombers to use incendiary bombs and fly low, because the buildings in Japan are not made of glass and steel and concrete. It's wood and paper, folks. And so we turned the entirety of Japan pretty much into an ashtray. And only after having done that did we drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Not in order to defeat Japan. We had basically already done that. But they hadn't surrendered yet. They definitely did shortly after seeing that crap, right? They had never seen anything like that before. Nobody had. Except, of course, yeah, the people who made it. But it wasn't to defeat Japan. It was for a third-party audience. Who was the third-party audience? Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, what is he called? I can't remember. But he was the leader of the Soviet Union. And so World War II had, basically come to a close in Europe, and we were looking to Stalin and saying, hey, look what we got, right? So you maybe have seen the pictures. I can't look at the pictures, right, of the aftermath of what happened to people in Japan when we dropped the atomic weapons. But it wasn't to stop them, it was to advertise to somebody else. So storming of Normandy, clearly a just war. That act, it's more open to question, I would submit, okay? So with that understood, there are three positions on the justifiability of war, with war understood as a military campaign waged by a particular entity. Justifiability of war, okay? Three positions. The first one rather cheekily calls itself realism, right? Cheekily, I say, because if you disagree with them, they can say, well, you're just not being realistic, right? Get out of here, John Lennon, right? Under realism, right, that's Hobbes was a realist. We called Hobbes a realist because instead of talking about ideas, he talked about power. And so to the realist perspective on war, morality doesn't apply, and only power matters. We are allies with France only because it enhances our own power. The second France becomes a liability, we cut them off. And people are talking a lot about Israel these days and whether or not they serve our interests or whether or not they're an albatross around our neck, right? But when you're talking about international relations, the realist says it's just power that matters, okay? Because that's the world we live in. The world is a jungle. The world is not Kantian, right? It's Hobbesian. And so the person that we identify most with this perspective is Henry Kissinger. Okay, you may have heard of him. He passed recently. But you could look up Kissinger and Cambodia. Right, we were fighting a war in Vietnam to stop them from going communist. Cambodia wasn't even involved in the war. They're just a bunch of farmers. But we blew the shit out of Cambodia because we thought that Vietnam was running weapons through their country. We couldn't prove it. There was talk from the Nixon administration about a bamboo Pentagon. Well, the bamboo Pentagon was very much as much of a dream as Iraq's WMD, okay? So Henry Kissinger. The second perspective is the other end of the spectrum, pacifism. Now there's clowny pacifism, right, that I discussed a moment ago, that violence is never justifiable, even in self-defense. That seems untenable, right? You can't make that argument, right? I mean, you can, but then you open yourself, right? Gandhi, right, was one who argued that all resistance should be nonviolent, and he had philosophical reasons for that. Ahimsa and Satyagraha, but that's a diversion I don't have time for. Unfortunately, it's pretty awesome. And he was asked, right, because he was alive during World War II, all right, buddy, so what are you going to do about Hitler? He goes, yeah, that's a tough case. We could maybe stop Hitler, but only after a great deal of suffering. Like, are you sure, man? I don't know. I think the Nazis would just win, right? So the second version of pacifism, which is the non-clowny version, says that morality can be applied, and it's a fact that the evasion of armed conflict, that nonviolence is always the most moral option, right? So do everything you can to avoid conflict, but if you can act in self-defense, okay, that's the non-clowny part. The third is, as you might imagine, a compromise position between the two, and it's called just war tradition. Okay, just war tradition is the statement that war can be morally justified, but in order to be justified, certain standards must be met. Okay, and those standards come in two sets. They're in Latin for convenience. One set of standards is called jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum means justice toward war. This is what I call the why. The why. And we're not going to focus on that one so much, but I'll just give you a brief description. It contains such conditions as, right, justice towards war means what are the reasons you're giving to initiate military readiness for combat, right? The first is that war can only be declared by a legitimate authority. In the United States, who is that?
Congress?
That's right. Most of the time I get the president. And you're forgiven for believing that because that's why we call Vietnam a police action and not a war. That's why Vladimir Putin is calling it a special operation, not an invasion of Ukraine, right? So very good, Congress. The second one is that we have to have a just cause, right? We have to have a good reason for doing it. In other words, self-defense or the defense of one's allies, not, for example, territorial expansion. Looking at you, Putin, all right? The third one is that we have a right intention, right? Such as the restoration of peace and justice, not in order to take revenge, okay? 4 is that it's the last resort, right? That's the part of compromise with pacifism, right? And there are others, but again, I'm just going to try to give you a general idea of how jus ad bellum works. The one we're going to look at more closely is the second set of standards that must be met. If you don't meet these standards and you wage a war, you can be accused of conducting war crimes. And then it's time for you to go to Nuremberg and get judged and possibly hanged. Jus in bello is the second set of standards, and there are only 2 of them, right? Jus in bello means justice in war. I call this one the how. The how you're doing it, right? You can go about defeating the enemy, but you can't just, kill children because they might become a soldier someday, right? Jus in bello has 2 main conditions. The first is the principle of proportionality. The principle of proportionality. According to the principle of proportionality, the harm done in seeking the goal of your war, the harm must not exceed the expected good. What does that sound like?
Utilitarianism.
Thank you, brother. You're right. You're batting 1,000 today. That's exactly right. That's utilitarianism. It's the state of Israel's stated policy that they will not obey the principle of proportionality, and that's why, 900 some Jews were killed, right, on October 7th, 3 years ago now. But they kill up Palestinians at a ratio of 10 to 1, right? 10 or 15 to 1, right? The second one is called, and this is the one we're really going to focus on, the principle of space in my words. The principle of discrimination. The principle of discrimination states that non-combatants cannot be targeted with military force. Okay? So if this one's a utilitarian one, this one says you cannot target non-combatants. There's certain things you just can't do to these type of people. That's Kantian, right? It's also a Hobbesian justification for the principle of discrimination. How is it Hobbesian? Why is it okay to aim military force at an enemy combatant? Because when an enemy combatant takes up, right, as part of the social contract, we forego our liberty to rape, murder, and pillage. Well, when you become a soldier, you avail yourself of that liberty to use lethal force, to murder, right? Or to kill, whatever name we give it, right? And so if you reclaim that liberty for yourself, you thereby make yourself a legitimate target, okay? Right, non-combatants must never be targeted. Now, so who's a non-combatant?
Civilians.
Sorry?
Civilians.
Basically, yeah, what we might even call the innocents, right? But has anybody ever seen American Sniper? That opening scene where the mom has the grenade and they shoot her and her kid picks it up. And then they don't show what happens afterwards, but you kind of have to imagine, right? Because the soldiers live. So, and of course, in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're not only not wearing uniforms, some of them are fighting along our side in the daytime and then shooting at us at night, right? It depends on the time of day, whether or not they're a combatant. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's not difficult, right? But in any case, the role that a combatant plays has to be connected to military activity, which does not include drug smugglers in the Caribbean. Just in case you in case you're talking to Pete Hegseth later today. And I think I need to leave it there, my friends. The last part is kind of about a number of moving parts that I want to stick together. So we'll pick that up on Wednesday. Do you guys have any questions before we adjourn? That was kind of a fast clip. Thank you for letting me get everything in there. I just want to make sure that Wednesday I leave as much time as possible for you guys to kind of connect all these things together and feel comfortable writing this red paper. Okay? We don't want stress. Any questions before we adjourn? Thanks, you guys. Good to see you, the elite crew today. Let me know if you need anything at all, and we'll see you Wednesday. Thank you.
Let me show you my communication cards. He kind of read it over and he told us we can go on Wikipedia to write questions.
I got a job at the USPS. Oh, nice. Yeah, I'm not going to be homeless. I got a job offer. If they drug test me, I'm fine. Anyway.
I'm hoping to finish up
the second essay tonight.
Yeah, yes, good.
I am struggling with Nietzsche.
Do you want to do an outline with me? Or
well, I just have like one main question for you.
Oh, good.
Because I
We
find
can email about it though too, I'm saying.
Okay.
I got time. Go for
I
it.
find Nietzsche the most compelling of the three.
Okay, that's good.
But he is really dense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well that's deliberate.
Yeah.
He's non-linear. He says, I know I'm only going to be talking to about 5 or 10 people in this world. He's not afraid of elitism at all.
And I get the sense that he writes